brand package and kind of some of the things that you'll want to think about when putting together a brand package. And this can be for a corporation, or it can be for a project that you're working on, or like the zine we just did, it can be just the things you're thinking about within that one project. To help me with that, and you might hear the difference, but I have a new microphone versus the last video that I did, so hopefully this is a little bit better quality than what I've had recently. But to help me with that, I have my wife, Sarah Graves, who does quite a bit of branding, and let her introduce herself.
Thank you. So, like Wyndham said, my name is Sarah Graves, and I work at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts, where I was on the team that established our new branding that rolled out 2 years ago now. So part of my job is exhibition design, as well as maintaining the museum's brand and style guide.
And so give a little bit of background on your education coming into the museum field, because I like my students to know kind of where people come from into the jobs that they have.
Sure. So my education makes no sense for what I do with my job and with my roles at the museum. I have a bachelor's in anthropology and a minor in art history. My master's is in classical civilizations with a focus in museum studies, and then my PhD is in art education with a focus on exhibitions. The reason that I do graphic design is because, one, I have an art background, so from being exposed to the arts for a long period of time, I developed an eye for what looks good. And also, I worked in IT for several years, working at the computer store at Florida State, and did graphic design while working in the College of Human Sciences, doing all of their media and promotions and development materials, also at Florida State. So it's something that I like doing, and something that just kind of happened as part of my job while working on my education.
So we're going to talk about brand stuff today, and I think a lot of people think when they think of brands as like the logo that a company has and maybe a color or two, if that. But I think that kind of people fixate really heavily on logos over all else, when actually a brand is this huge combination of items. So we're going to talk a little bit about all those other items today. And well, again, we may all think of this as a corporate branding package. When you do a branding package, Sarah, what are you guys doing branding for? Because you're not rebranding the museum every few months, but what do you do your branding for?
God, no, I'm so glad we're not rebranding the museum every few months. It's a lot of work to create a brand, and most of the time what I do, and I work with my colleague Stephen, who is the head of communications at the museum, we work together to brand the exhibitions that are going to have art on the floor. So each exhibition, if it is not of the museum's permanent collection, which is the art that the museum owns, so that means loans coming from external institutions or collaborations or art installations, each exhibition needs to have its own brand. So that means the catalog, any web materials, any content that comes with the exhibition, email signature, color, typeface, spacing, everything needs to be wrapped up into this one brand, this bubble that when you look at it, you know exactly what that exhibition is going to be. No matter where you are, it's all consistent and all the same kind of feel.
So, but that branding within the exhibition is different than the branding from the museum, but I guess I'm going to make the assumption here that from exhibition to exhibition, they all kind of feel like they're a family of designs?
Correct. So if the museum is curating the exhibition, if we have full control over the exhibition, then we use our museum brand as a baseline and then build off of it. If we are co-curating or an outside curator is managing an exhibition, like we have an exhibition coming up where the curator is actually from out in California, and we are serving as the venue for the art that's going to be on view. So she had full control over that kind of branding. We actually just worked with the designer to make sure that everything was consistent, so we received all the materials we needed to maintain the exhibition brand.
Okay, so that's somebody else's design coming into your space.
Correct.
Kind of like Publix doesn't get to decide how Kellogg's branding looks, they just put it on the shelf, right?
Correct.
Okay. All right, so let's start with identity first, and I think that identity is something that gets subsumed into the visual aesthetic of a thing, but oftentimes identity can be things like the idea, and let's just keep using the museum as an example for right now, but the museum is an American art museum. Because of that, there are certain choices that are made, and there are certain ideas that have to come across to make that apparent, because otherwise the choices of work that would be at the museum would be really inappropriate. We'll get through that as we get through the rest of this stuff, and that should make a little bit more sense. One of the big important things with a brand package, and as designers, why it's important for you to come up with a brand package, is that it keeps you from having to make choices later on. You never want to be sitting down to do a design and have to make radical choices in that moment. Really, what you want is the plan ahead of time, and then really most of your design is honestly not that creative. It's the implementation of those existing choices. And Sarah's nodding right now, so I'm going to let her add a little bit into that.
Right, so every once in a while I get a design intern, which I love because it gives me a chance to teach what I don't normally get to teach, which is also why I'm excited to talk here. Every design intern that comes to me wants to make everything from scratch, and we don't make anything from scratch at the museum because that takes a lot of time and a lot of work, and it takes up other people's time that are busy and they're doing their own jobs, and we don't have time to wait on them to approve it, and they don't have time to go through and review everything that we do. So I like to tell them the best way to approach a set design is realizing that it's a puzzle. You have to make whatever design work within that brand.
Yeah, and I think that used two really good words there, review and approval. If you're working from a brand package, you should not be doing anything that requires somebody else's review or approval. If you are doing something that you think might be iffy, that might be questionable from a brand package, then that brand package either doesn't have all of the things you need, somebody did a bad job making the brand package, or B, you're going outside the bounds. And that's something that you need to consider, that if you think you might need approval for something, you might be going a little far afield from the prompts you've been given by the brand package. So designing the brand package is almost like designing a set of rules for a game or something, where if everybody else at the table is going to get upset because you all of a sudden just took a bunch of cards off the top of the deck, well, that's not within the rules. Maybe you don't do that. So if you need somebody else's approval, or if you think it's going to make somebody else upset, then maybe that is not the thing to do.
Something else I want to add to that is, at least in the museum, we're an education institution. That's part of our mission, is education. And in order to educate properly and make sure that everything is accessible for our public, we need to follow our brand because it's already been checked through contrast to make sure that it's easy to see. We use a typeface that is approved by the American Art Alliance, because that way anyone who has difficulties with visibility, we know that typeface is approved, and so we're not going to run into any of those issues.
And by difficulties with visibility, we're not talking about people who wear camo to the museum. We're talking about people who have issues seeing, so that can be contrast issues with poor eyesight. That can be older people. That can be much younger people. Most people don't realize that small children actually have visual acuity issues as well. And there can be issues with color contrast. There are people that are a handful of different kinds of colorblind. And so when we pick these things, we need to make sure that we are being very conscious of people with visual impairments, of people with the various kinds of color blindness. And one thing that a lot of people don't think about is difficulties reading. And those difficulties reading can be from education, and they can also be from things like dyslexia that can affect people. And some people don't even actually know that they have dyslexia, but they just find that some documents or some books are easier to read than others. This is something that I've probably brought up before in one of these talks, and I bring up in graphic design classes a lot. If you have a friend that doesn't like to read any books at all, but has read every Harry Potter book, there's a very good chance that that person is dyslexic, because the font they chose in those books is an anti-dyslexic font. Because it was meant for kids, it was meant for adults, and it's actually easier to read than a lot of other fonts. And so they chose something that was appropriate for their audience, and so that's an interesting test case. So let's start with color first. So when you guys are picking out colors for a design at the museum, or if I want to pick out colors for a brand, what are some go-tos? What are some things to avoid?
So we actually have, for the museum brand, so this is something that the museum has full control over, we have a set of approved colors that are what we always use. I'm not including black, white, or gray. I'm using actual colors. So we have 3 tiers. We have a dark, we have a medium, and then we have a pop. And of each of those, we then have blues, greens, warms, and pinks. So using those colors, we have a lot of flexibility with our brand, but part of choosing those colors was we made sure that every one of those colors would match with the other color in some way. We also established rules for when to use a pop color, which is something that's going to be lighter and a little bit more neon, to when you use a dark color, which is going to be something like a really deep purple or a navy or even like a hunter green. We use the medium colors the most, and then the other 2 as accents where it is appropriate.
And when you're talking about warm colors, not pink, we could also think of those as like the fall colors of like orange and brown.
Orange, yellow, and red are our warm colors, because they're not, we could call them reds, but it wasn't as accurate because yellow is so different from red, and they're both primary colors.
With those colors that you have, are people allowed to use those in whatever combination that they want, or are there prescribed sets of colors that work together? Are they allowed to have, let's say, light text on a dark background, or is there a preference for dark text on a light background?
So it depends. You cannot use the museum colors any which way you want. We have set colored palettes that we provide to people. We prefer to have a white background with black text, if it's going to be body text, if it's going to be red. We also prefer to have a pop color with a dark color if you're creating any kind of header. That way it's as high contrast as possible to make it very easy to read.
And that's to both easy to read from a distance as well as easy to read for people with color issues.
Absolutely. And we rarely use 2 of the same color together, or color group. So we wouldn't use blue on blue all the time. We would use something that would have a higher contrast.
Okay. Yeah, that's always a good idea. There are some instances in the corporate world where you may want to use, I hesitate to say a rainbow of the same color, but a range of the same color. It can be very calming, it can be very peaceful, but it does eat up your contrast, and it does kind of subdue the design, which can be what you're after. But in an educational institution like the museum, where the point is getting the information across, then maybe that's not what we're going for, but that is up to you when you're coming up with your brand package.
Something I want to add in there is, because we are an art museum, we assume that most of our visitors are there on their feet. They are not sitting and taking the time to read. So we want to make sure that all of our materials are as easy to access and read as possible, because we're assuming that they're going to be standing for 5, 10, 20 minutes, or even an hour if we're lucky.
And this comes in when I mean, if you design a billboard, you have to consider that the person's flying by it at 70 miles an hour, and you have maybe 10 seconds of legibility, if that, on that billboard. If you have a poster in a hallway, nobody stops to look at those posters. You get as much time as that person takes to walk by that poster. If you have a t-shirt, it is as much time as that person is standing in front of another person. The amount of time that we associate with looking at art is not the amount of time you get when you're talking about more, I hesitate to say mundane, but mundane design. When you're designing these bits of text, when you're designing headlines, when you're designing logos and brands and things like that, oftentimes that time is extremely condensed compared to, say, sitting down and watching a movie, or even sitting in an art museum and enjoying a painting. You can sit there and look and look and look. Most people are not going to do that with logos, and we need to be considerate as designers of that time crunch. Now let's move on. While we're talking about legibility and people having to be on their feet for it, the fonts that are chosen, how do you guys pick your fonts?
So we have a set sans serif font, which is Helvetica Neue, and then we have a set serif font, which is Palatino Linotype. We, 9 times out of 10, use the Helvetica Neue. One, because it has, I think, 100 different types and styles and designs that accompany with it. Weights, thank you. So that makes it easy to add and subtract and use a hierarchy, which we'll talk about later, using the same typeface, so there won't be any clash. But sometimes, especially in, I'm not going to say fancy, but kind of fancy installations like portraits, something with people in fancy dresses or hairdos, the curators would prefer having something that has that kind of script feel. And so Palatino, which is the serif font, has a really beautiful flow, but is still highly legible.
And this is something that both of those fonts are available in the Adobe suite, and both those fonts are available in Microsoft Office, I would assume.
I don't know if Helvetica Neue is, but I know you could download a free version, but it doesn't come with all 50
with all the weights. It
Correct.
comes with just the very simple ones. So that's something that's very important to think about, is when you're coming up with a brand package, the company or the organization that you're coming up with that brand package for, who's going to be using it? Is it just graphic designers that are using your brand package? Is it normal, quote unquote, normal people that are using your brand package? And what software do those people generate documents in? For Alabama State University, for my department, we use Google Docs for everything. So if I'm developing a brand package, which I don't because we have one for the university, but if I was going to develop one for the department, then what I would want to do is look through and use fonts that are easily available in the Google Docs suite. Because I don't want somebody who doesn't know much about computers to have to go find and download and install a font that isn't just there. So think about who's going to be using your brand package. Not only what are the best fonts, but what are the fonts that are going to be available. Because if they're not available, or if they're hard to get to, then what you're going to have is you're going to have a few people not creating documents to your spec. So you're not going to have a brand anymore. Your brand is going to start to fall apart if some people are creating public-facing documents or even internally facing documents that don't match. Right? The matching is going to fall apart, and it's really going to cause the whole brand to suffer. So do be very considerate when you're picking these very specialist fonts, that if people can't find them or get them or afford them in some cases, because some of these fonts are not cheap, you need to be considerate about how the people are going to be using them. So you do need to know, is this a Microsoft Office institution? Is this a Google Docs institution? Is this just a bunch of graphic designers that all have Illustrator and are completely comfortable installing whatever bizarre font you come up with?
Something else with you providing fonts and typefaces to other institutions is some fonts will not let you package them and email them to another institution to use. They have built-in copyright licenses that you have to pay to use them, even if if they were already on your computer. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can send them to another computer. So we've actually run into this with several exhibitions where an outside designer used typefaces and it looked great, and then they sent us the packaged files and we could not use the typeface, and so we actually had to purchase it, which cost about $900.
If you ever need the workaround for that, you can outline the type in Illustrator and InDesign, but it causes the file size to just skyrocket, and it's probably also some kind of piracy. But don't do that, but if you need to.
And this is also, that only works with logos. If we need something for...
You can do it with body type, it just makes the file size gigantic. You can outline it.
I understand, but if we're generating... We're not going to argue with this. We will be here forever.
And getting on into something that I think that some people don't even think about is not picking colors, picking font, picking a logo. Of course, that makes sense. That's stuff that we all think about. But things like formatting. When I think about formatting, I'm thinking about how I do stuff like, do phone numbers have periods in between the sections, or do they have dashes? What do you add in as like your formatting requirements for your organization?
We have an extensive style guide, and this is a large chunk of my job, is everything that goes out into the world from the museum is run through me or run through one of my colleagues who are the holders of the style guide. And our style guide consists of things like you're talking about, periods. We use periods instead of dashes in phone numbers. It's when to use certain numerals versus when to use or spelling out the word. It's something as basic as grammar, but then it's also, do we use circa or do we use about when it comes to dates? Do we use in dashes or hyphens? So everything that comes out of the museum runs through the style guide to ensure consistency.
And that's one. A brand package can also be referred to as a style guide. They're not entirely interchangeable, but they are similar ideas because you want everything coming out of an organization, coming out of a brand, to feel very much the same. And a style guide is that thing. So formatting can be those things that you just talked about. The idea of we use these words, that happens all the time. If you look at press releases from certain organizations versus other organizations, you will see different words being used, especially if you look at different types of organizations. Like if you look at a retail organization, say something like Nike or Adidas or Apple, versus say a nonprofit that deals in social justice issues, they're going to use completely different base word sets, and they're going to have ideas about the age of their readership, the average age of readership, the reading ability of their readership. They're going to have assumptions about how much attention they're going to get, and that can be audiences within a brand too. Like, I'm not saying that every audience for Nike has the same reading level, but those documents will be curated to match those people. So Nike's annual earnings report will be different than their tweets about their new shoe.
So we have something like that, which is ephemeral versus publication. And so ephemeral are things that are just out to the public. They're not going through any peer review or formal catalog or anything like that. It's things like tweets, Facebook posts, even our newsletter is seen as ephemeral. You could also consider it casual, whereas publications require a certain type of verbiage and a certain type of language. And so there is a little bit of a difference of that, but all of that is outlined in our style guide, so there are no questions for anyone making anything at the museum.
Yeah, and ephemeral is the temporary documents. They're the temporary pieces of communication, whereas the publication ones are the ones that are going to go into essentially what is the permanent record. And those things are the more academic stuff. They're the more legal stuff. They're the bigger, heavier documents. And those should have a different tone to them. They should not be the same. If they are the same, that's a little bit weird. And now, how do you guys use this stuff to develop hierarchy? So hierarchy is a really big, important thing in design that we use all the time, right? We want you to look at this, and then we want you to look at that, and then we want you to look at that. And we want to know how you're going to look at things and in what order. So what do you guys use to build a hierarchy?
So this is where having a heavy-duty typeface like Helvetica Neue really helps, because we establish what our headings will be, we establish what our subheadings and subtitles will be, and what body paragraphs will be, body text. So usually we have a really heavy header, something that's either bold, condensed, or extra heavy, to let people know this is what this section is going to be about. We want it under 7 words, so that way you really can walk right by and read it. Think newspaper headline on the front page.
And that's an important thing, the way you said, under 7 words. The fact that you have defined it not only in font and a specific weight and probably a size, but also 7 words. That's all you get. And that's a really interesting and important concept to say that, like, well, is it 7 words or is it 100 characters? What is it? Is there a conceptual limit to, does it have to be a sentence? Is it a full sentence, or does it need to be part of a sentence, or is it only statements or only questions? And those are all things that we can add into our own style guides for whatever we want to do. So if you have a nonprofit that is about the environment, do you want every tweet to be a question about what somebody can do with their time to make the environment better? Or do you want it to be a statements of fact or statements of opinion? So when you guys do your 7 words, are you looking at legibility? Are you looking at statement? Are you looking at question? Or is it simply just you want to get some information into somebody's head as they're moving past it?
We leave that open because each exhibition is different. Each subject is different. Where in a portrait, you could have something like at first glance, and that would be enough to tell you what you're going to read about, right? That's going to be something that, what you see on the surface at first glance. It's going to be something that's quick and fleeting. But if you're dealing with something like we have a civil rights exhibition coming up, you might want it to be a little bit more to give people a clue about what they're going to read about. You don't want it to be vague. You want it to maybe be a sentence that helps people understand exactly what they're going to read about while staying within the parameters that we have. Something else I want to add about having a header as a question is 9 times out of 10, if you read a question as a header, the answer is no.
Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the advantages of having a pre-built style guide as opposed to jumping in and kind of building a style guide as you go. The style guide that you walked into when you started at the museum was one that was generated over time, and then you guys kind of wiped the floor and reset the whole thing. Can you talk a little bit about building one from scratch as opposed to dealing with an evolving style guide?
So the museum has had 3 different brandings. I hesitate to call the second one, the one in the middle that we adjusted, a brand, because it was not informed by anyone with any brand training or eye. It just kind of happened with the rise of the digital age in a city museum and then was adapted. The museum has been around since 1930, and so for the first 80 years or so, we used what was imposed by the city. We used the branding that was already established. It was 2 little M's on top of each other that kind of looked like stacked turtles. And it was something where if you had it embossed on a card or something that was really shiny, it looked very professional and very fancy. But it did not have anything accompanying it to impart what that brand meant. So unless you already knew what that stamp was, it did not share that information. And back before the internet and the rise of computers, that was less of an issue because it was always going to be on something that had additional information. But with technology, information became rampant and worldwide, and so the brand was adjusted to follow this kind of Helvetica Neue or Palatino type, to try to share more information within the brand itself instead of relying on accompanying materials. The brand in the middle, that I say was kind of rough, started in 2003 and it was used through 2018. And that was obviously dated. It had dated colors. Someone designed it, and I don't know who, but they did not use alignment or any kind of spacing guides. And so each logo that was made was a little different each time because people would move the letters around. The colors were pastel, which was very late 90s, early 2000s. So there were a lot of things that if you just looked at it without any kind of design focus, it was fine. But it wasn't consistent, and if you saw all of the brands that people were using or all the logos that the people were using together for the same institution, you could see they were all a little bit different.
When we're talking about these documents, it's not easy to make a document that covers every single situation.
No.
So when you come to a new situation, how is that handled in document? Are you guys going back and adding into your style guide when you come up with new things?
Yes, absolutely. So the style guide is a living document, but there are only certain people who can update it. It is me and two other people, and it is not the head of communications because he is the one who comes up with a lot of ideas, and I am the one that tells him no about 90% of the time.
And so that's an important concept, and that's something that I've referred to, I think before, I refer to that as having a red team, where you want your most avant-garde designers, you want your most exploratory designers to have people to act as an anchor. You want to have people who say no, who say, this is not the way we do that. This creative idea, great. This one breaks the brand. And with that breaking of the brand, that can cause an entire style guide to almost collapse. So you do need those people to say, hey, that's not going to work for what we're doing here. These things are fine. These things are not. Is there a particular limit that you guys put on new design, or is it simply will it or will it not fit within the style guide?
So if the design is from us and staying within the style guide, there's a lot of flexibility as long as you stay in the brand itself. I know I'm saying everything needs to stay within the brand, but it's flexible because we're an art museum. The new thing should not be the text or the typeface. It should be how the art is presented. So whether that's in a poster or a flyer or blown up on the wall or using QR codes or anything like that, we have these structures built in, so the art is what is most important, not the brand.
So your style guide is for the documents that make the package that the actual product, quote-unquote product, is coming in.
Yes.
So if you were Nike, you're not dictating what goes on the shoe, you're dictating what goes on the box.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. And that doesn't mean that style guide and brands packages don't dictate that stuff. They definitely do. You can think of very, very simple branding like Supreme, or I think that was a popular thing a few years ago. That was a very simple brand that applied to every single object within their brand identity.
Well, and an example I automatically think of is Apple. Apple is very simple and very rigid.
And that's actually an interesting example of a brand that has evolved over time and doesn't actually always evolve in lockstep. You can see instances where certain design cues outlast others, certain things get replaced really quickly. They'll switch fonts, they switch logos. They're on their third major logo right now, the solid white simple Apple. For a little while it was the silver fancy Apple, and then before that
the rainbow.
It was the rainbow Apple that most people have nostalgia for. Nobody has nostalgia for the strange silver Apple. And that's something that a lot of brands are kind of hitting on now, is this nostalgia kick as well. And now, this is kind of a little bit of a non sequitur, but going your brand is very much what you guys do when you're designing exhibition materials. What do you give to the rest of the organization when you want them to comply with the style guides?
So everybody has access to the style guide. It is dated and it is read only. So that way you know when it was last updated. And if you were part of that decision, then you know, well, I remember that let's say that Stephen comes to me and says, well, I remember that I submitted this edit in October of 2011, and it says that this was updated in October 2010. So where's my update? And so that is one way for us to remain accountable. But also, along with all staff having access to this style guide itself, they have access to all of the typefaces. We made sure when we purchased the typeface Helvetica Neue that it was on all computers, so that way there was a minimal editing process. People could start with all of the right tools from the beginning. And then there's the review process. Even if they say they followed everything with the style guide, it still goes through me.
Yeah, and going through a review is a really important thing. With smaller organizations, sometimes you can get everybody on board, but even for yourself, sometimes it's good to have somebody else to look over your documents and just make sure that you are, that you're living up to your own requirements.
And I also have someone to edit my stuff. So I don't edit my own documents because I already know what I wrote, and so it's easy to skim and skip. I always have someone, even two people, look over something before I approve it and send it out there if it was something that I made.
Now, we can finally get to the thing that a lot of younger designers are really infatuated with, which is the logo. And the logo, if you notice, we have not talked about the logo at all yet, because really it ends up being a relatively small portion of a brand's identity. It is the thing that we think about when we think off the top of our heads, but it's just not even the major portion of a brand. And so when you're thinking about what makes a good logo, not a great logo, not one of the logos that goes down through the centuries, of course, but when you're thinking about a good logo, what makes a logo good?
So I think what makes a logo good, there are some things that are definitely set in stone, right? Like easy to see, easy to immediately understand. I personally like a very punny logo, a logo that uses puns. Like I think Burger King is one of the greatest logos in the history of design because it makes a burger, in case you didn't know. But I personally hate logos as a designer because there's a reason why logo designers make all the money. It takes time and a certain kind of creativity and thought process and very little hubris or confidence or not confidence, what's the word? Ego. Because when you are in the logo business, the first thing you make is not what somebody picks. It's like the 100th thing that you make. And you have to make sure that it's right and that it's something that's going to last for years, because otherwise, what's the point of having it?
And one thing to consider is, Sarah said that logos are where the money is. Really, logos are where the money is on a per project basis, but honestly, there just aren't that many logos in the world, and people don't change their logos that often. For people who make a living in design, chances are they're not doing logos most of the time.
And where I say where the money is, I mean, it's going to cost you a lot of money to have someone make you a logo. You are not going to make a lot of money making logos. Someone is going, like, if you need a logo, you better have the money to pay for it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it honestly, and oftentimes goes through a large group of people to do that design work. It's not an individual doing that thing.
No, it's a firm.
Even at an institution as small as the museum, we've talked about 3 people that are regularly involved in their day-to-day design process, not including something like the logo, but just managing and furthering the brand package and the identity of the museum.
Something else with logos that you have to consider is how it looks in color, black and white, and grayscale. Because a logo can look great some way, and then if you flip it or put it as a white design, or if it's a multicolor logo and you switch it to grayscale or to black and white, it can ruin a logo. Whereas if you're dealing with a brand in general, you won't necessarily have those issues.
Yeah, and one thing you have to think about with a logo is that unless that logo is entirely made of type, there is quite a bit of interpretation going on. And that interpretation can be massively affected by things like color, by things like print quality. Things to some extent outside of the control of the designer. But if you have text, if you have the text Apple, or if you have the text Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts, we know what those things are. With the logo, everything has to work together to tell us what that thing is. You don't get that fallback position of the basic data.
Right. If you think of the Nike logo with just that check mark, if you didn't know already from your 20 years of hearing Nike with the check mark, you wouldn't know that a check mark meant shoes.
Yeah, the object in no way relates itself with shoes. You can think about the Adidas 3 stripes. Honestly, if you look at it, it kind of looks like maybe they do something with mountains. It looks nothing like shoes. It does not match the thing. There's no alignment there. Now, kind of to wrap this up, when you do come to one of these new situations, when something does come in that has not been covered in the design documents to that point, how is that handled? It's added back into the document, but who decides on those things?
How it usually works, and it sounds like I'm really throwing my colleague Steven under the bus here, but he's in communications and design, so he's usually the one causing the most trouble. So Steven, let's say he wanted to use a different typeface for some reason. Helvetica Neue wasn't going to cut it. Palatino wasn't going to cut it. A curator came to him and said they wanted to use, God forbid, Chiller. And so they decided that would be the correct case. If it was a one-off, it was not going to be a change to the style guide. If it was going to just be an exception, then it would not be incorporated into the style guide. However, if we use Chiller and somehow it really worked for what we were trying to say for our brand, and Steven wanted to switch from Helvetica Neue to Chiller, then we would incorporate that into every other type of branding that we normally do to make sure that the consistency went past what he used it before. So maybe it worked great in a newsletter and really showed the best side of what he was trying to convey, but it didn't work in the catalog. It didn't work for any kind of digital branding on our website, and so it stayed that exception and it was not incorporated. But that is how we switched from Helvetica to Helvetica Neue, because the spacing and kerneling and flexibility of the typeface actually was better in Helvetica Neue for our institution than just straight Helvetica, which has some accessibility, some readability issues.
So the one-off mutations are not included.
No.
Only the absolutely most successful changes get included back into the original document. Everything else is an exception every time.
Correct. And we have very few exceptions.
Yeah, and to be fair, that is the way that a design guide should be. A design guide should be comprehensive enough and should be detailed enough that you don't really need exceptions, and you don't really need to also be making decisions. Again, just like going back to the beginning, exceptions are a problem and decisions are a problem. If you're having to do either of those things, there's something wrong with the style guide you've made. There's something wrong with your brand package. All right. thank you very much for joining me, Sarah. If anybody has any questions, please let me know. You know how to get in contact with me. Hopefully, this helps you guys in building your brand packages and building your style guides and building your brands. And this is not just for you building a brand for somebody else. This is also for yourself. I have a list of fonts that I use. I have a list of colors that I use for myself. I have logos that I use for myself in different places. I even have basic formats for documents that I use more than other things. And that's something that just makes me feel like more of a consistent person when I present myself in the world. And that sounds very silly, but we do it all the time. If you're a person who wears jeans, you're a person who wears jeans. If you're a person who wears cargo pants, you're a person who wears cargo pants. If you wear high heels every day to work, you do that thing. If you wear boots every day, you do that thing. That is kind of a personal style guide that you've unconsciously created. What we're doing here is just consciously writing it down. We're creating that thing ahead of time and then ascribing to it afterwards.
And the only thing I would add to that is while it sounds like a style guide or a brand can kind of crush your creativity, when you make materials for 15 to 20 exhibitions a year, having guidelines means that you can put your creative focus where it really matters, and those things that need to be flexible and different and creative, and where the other things that don't matter can fall into your format so they can be done quickly.
All right, guys, have a lovely evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. And again, if you need me, just reach out.